on your videos. We have a few questions from the participants. I will invite participants to please pop any further questions up in the chat as we go. We've got around 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes for questions. I'll start back at the top with Dan. We've got a question around welfare auditing. How do you see welfare auditing or benchmarking playing into the preservation of social license in the future?
Yeah, absolutely, super question. I mean, we not only need to say what we do, we just demonstrate what we do, and that needs to be verifiable. And so, yeah, absolutely, the presence of these kinds of mechanisms just allows us to have basically evidence to show we're living up to the practices that we've articulated and that we're proud of. It's a sort of a virtuous cycle, right? We need to begin by articulating our values, deciding on methods of achieving those, but then showing people that we actually live up to it. And it has the extra advantage too of then when there is sort of a bad apple identified, let's say through a video expose, that allows everybody else to say, well, that's not me. And I can show it's not me because here's the evidence associated with it. And it illustrates what is an outlier, what is a sort of a bizarre and unacceptable practice from what should be the mainstream of what we do on farms.
Great, thank you, Dan. There's a similar question here, which I'm actually going to hand over to Richard to comment on, just around navigating the social license. So question here, new technologies such as GM to feed a growing global population. I really like the reference to the little golden book images of farming. Are we at the mercy of the activists and the socially aware to the detriment of a hungry population who benefit from dairy nutrition?
Great question. Look, there's some evidence that that's already been happening. If you look at things like the golden rice example, where you've got, a genetically engineered crop with a very significant health outcome for millions of people that has been held up because of opposition because it's been bred using GM techniques. So how do we, if that is happening, how do we participate in that environment for what we would consider to be a more equitable or more just outcome? I can only go back on what I was saying in that we obviously have not managed to convince enough people that we share the values around trust in terms of the outputs of that particular crop, golden rice, for instance, that would lead to that particular technology being approved. So yes, it is happening. How do we get it? How do we get around it? We've just got to keep demonstrating, as I thought, Emily talked about particularly well, that we do share the same values. Because I don't think inherently that we don't. I mean, that's a fundamental thing. We're all human beings. We all have the same fundamental values. And if we're really honest with ourselves in looking at those values, we probably will find some, it probably will be a bit confronting about some practices from time to time that we have to really question whether they're delivering the right outcome or not. And if we're doing that, we'll get the right results.
Yeah, I think there's some wonderful linkages there between all of your talks in that regard. Dan, did you have something further to add to that? Or
brilliant answer from Richard, but I would say a couple things. One is that actually, interestingly, I find that both the general public and farmers are actually very interested and supportive in general of technology. So, for example, they love robotic milkers, and so these kinds of technologies where the perceived they're interested in the perceived beneficiary of the technology, basically, who bears the benefits and who bears the harms. And they have heard enough of these stories over time to be suspicious of these things too, especially when they're coming from corporate interests. So they know that sometimes corporations sell benefits, but actually it's them that get the benefits and the harms go to others, including maybe workers, or maybe in this case individual farmers, or maybe individual animals. And so there's a lot of, I think there's a high level of skepticism, but I think in general actually people are quite open to technology. I will say one specific thing about GM technology. We're actually working specifically on this issue, and one interesting thing about that, very sobering thing for me as a dairy guy, is one of my colleagues working in this area is working on genetically modifying yeast to basically brew milk. And she is absolutely, so she's a technophile, loves tech, but she wants to use tech to put essentially dairy, what we think of dairy, out of business. And so tech isn't necessarily going to be friendly to what we do now. And so the general sort of friendliness by the public of technology, I would say, is probably more or less neutral to what we do. It really does come back to the things that both Richard and Emily were saying in terms of running a business that ultimately has values that are consistent with the values of our neighbors and our customers.
Thanks.
Sabrina, can I just follow up on a couple of things there, just to try and make some connections, because I completely agree with what Dan was just talking about. It's often said that people trust farmers, but they don't trust the business of farming, and I think that there's a lot of evidence of that, and they particularly don't trust big business around farming and corporate interests. Now, I'm actually going to introduce a note of perhaps hope, or that I think we're on the point of a significant change in that now, because there is such a rapidly emerging requirement for corporate interests to display metrics around what's called ESG, environmental, social and governance factors. And there's a couple of reasons for that. A, that they're being increasingly required from a regulatory point of view to do that. But B, there's lots and lots of evidence now that companies that have high performing ESG metrics just perform better. It's actually better for them from a business point of view, from financially, to be concerned about and delivering on ESG metrics. So there is this huge interest coming out of the corporate world now to deliver environmental and social outcomes, more than there's been for some time. It is a business driver now. It is not just a nice thing to do. Now, so that's good. The flip side of that is, because it will be a tradable commodity, there's going to be all sorts of metrics and data and systems around how that is demonstrated. And again, industry needs to really participate in that, or it will be done to industry rather than with industry.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, transparency, I think, is a really key issue. And Emily, I think you really presented a nice view of transparency and the importance of it. We have a couple of questions in that regard. One is, with running your farm visits, do you feel that there are any other emerging consumer concerns that we should be looking towards as an industry?
Overall, I think bull calves is the biggest thing. Every time I run a session, I get asked, what do you do with your bull calves? And for me, I can answer pretty honestly. We rear all of our bull calves. I do eventually go for meat, but you have to be realistic as well. Apart from that, once people see how the dairy is set up and how the cows actually live and what the process entails, they sort of leave not too worried. I do have a couple of people that, like Dan mentioned, once you educate them about how it all works, they sort of get a little bit horrified that the cows have a calf every year. But there's always going to be an element of that. It's just part of the process, and that's not something that we can change as far as having a profitable dairy business. So I think we know what the issues are, and they're not really changing. We just have to work on what they are.
Yeah, great. And I think just to follow on for that, Greg's actually asked a really key question here. in regards to what you've done with your business in showcasing how you run your business, how do you feel about other farmers moving past the farm gate and becoming potential targets? And how do you think you can mitigate that risk?
Yeah, so something we do as part of a farm visit is that we don't give out the farm address until people book tickets. Before that, they have the address of, I believe it's the Dungog Council building. So that's just something that we do to protect ourselves. We know that if people are paying for a visit to the farm, they're going to be interested, and they're not going to be the kind of people that are there to make you feel like you're being hunted or whatever. I do think you have to be very careful. While there are new laws that have been introduced to help protect us, they're not going to protect us from everything. So you need to be very careful and know exactly what your message is. You need to know how it's sounding from the other side, and understand how people will take it in, and also understand that different people will respond differently. I will say that not everybody should engage the public. You do need to understand how people work, and you need to have a lot of patience with what many people could call stupid questions, because you're going to have to answer them 500 times, in your experience. Yeah, I think, protecting yourself is tricky. You do expose yourself to a dangerous, exposure, but I don't know, I suppose it's a risk that you take, and you have to know how to handle the situation if that does arise. Typically for us, if we do have someone who comes to the farm and seems very hostile, we sort of say, we're here to engage and educate you. We're happy to take part in a conversation as long as you're happy to listen and respect our views, and we'll listen and respect yours in return.
Thanks, Emily. It's it's a major challenge, and I guess what I really like, particularly with UBC, Dan, is this avenue of transparency that you are taking with trying to engage the consumers. I guess a question from me to all of you, because I'm going to squeeze my own one in here. It's mainly a talking point around transparency and benchmarking. A lot of it is around the individual institution or the individual business. What role do you think that industry or even government has to play in mitigating the risk around increasing transparency?
I can start off if you'd like, Sabrina.
Yep.
I don't see much of a downside. It's interesting, Emily's saying in terms of the sort of the argumentative clients that she's had. I mean, I haven't had those people, and so maybe it's sort of slightly different sort of culture, but I think it's a matter of putting things together. Of course, if there's things we should hide, then we don't want to share them, right? But as Emily pointed out, then really we should have cleaned up our garbage before we started opening up the farm, right? This isn't rocket science. And so yes, if there's things that we're embarrassed of, we shouldn't be showing them off. We better clean up our mess. But otherwise, then we should be able to proceed with that conversation. One of the things I've been impressed with was the degree of essentially compassion and acceptance that people have. That I don't think they expect farmers to get it perfect. They expect farmers, as Richard pointed out, to have the right values, to care, to be trying, to be working towards it. Yeah, a calf might die, but they take it seriously and they're trying to work out why that calf dies and trying to make sure it didn't happen again. If they're blasé or they have very high mortality rates, et cetera, that's a real problem. It's a real problem for us as an industry. Of course, there's a communication problems for that farmer. So I guess from my perspective, I don't see the risk of communication. I see the risk of us not getting our act together.
That's a really good point, Dan. Richard, did you have a comment as well there?
Yeah, look, on the whole, agreeing with Dan, but also acknowledging that there is risk. I think the benefits outweigh the risks. And the biggest risks are that it will becoming aware of things that were previously hidden from view changes truths. Now, and this is where it sort of gets, you know, what the difference between a fact and a truth. The facts don't change. Now, there's a really great, I'm going to do a plug for our Farm Policy Journal, which is released today, I think, and there's an article, this current edition is all about policy making in a post-truth era. There's an article in this journal from Nick Enfield from the University of Sydney, I think, that is all about how when things that were previously hidden from view become public, it changes truths. The facts don't change, the practice hasn't changed, but just being visible now, people in seeing those facts have a different truth in now having different information at their disposal. And that's something we'll have to be aware of. I agree with Dan that it's the benefits of doing that outweigh the costs, but we can't expect that there won't be different truths that people have as a result.
Thank you. And we're just out of time. We do have a few more questions in the chat, but I'll have our panelists will have a look through those and be able to answer those hopefully. Thank you again to each of you for your participation, for your wonderful thought-provoking talks today. There's lots of discussion points that we can carry on with. If anyone has further questions, you can pop them in the chat and we can have a look through them. Otherwise, we will be sharing these presentations at the end. So I'll hand over to Yanni now. Thank you once again to all the speakers.
Thank you very much, Sabrina, and thank you very much all the speakers. We have had two fantastic sessions on business, really understanding a good approach to managing risk and the drivers of profitability. Thank you very much, Bill Malcolm, Sheena Carter, Justin Walsh, and the facilitator, Greg Duncan, for the first session. And really thank you so much again to you, Sabrina, and all the speakers, Dan, Richard, and Emily. A fantastic insight in terms of the issues that really are affecting the industry and the things that we should really consider into the future. I think it's been really enlightening. Thank you so much, everyone. I will remind all the attendees that we have tomorrow another full session, two sessions actually, between 9 and 12 p.m., 9 a.m. Australian Eastern Time. And we will be concentrating on the emerging science with Rupert Brumeyer from the University of Bern, 7 emerging scientists from Australia, and the innovation session with Sabrina, Neil Bullock, and Andrew Smith with a panel at the end. So I really hope you can join us tomorrow again. Thanks so much for attending, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you.